Hello, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to today's webinar, The Perils of Outsourcing Asset Allocation to a Risk Score. I'm Andy Finnegan, Marketing Lead, Nebo Wealth. Joined by my senior colleagues, I have Matt Cadnar, who's our Sales Lead, and I have Martin Tarley, who's our Product Lead. Good morning, guys.
Morning, everyone.
We are coming to you live from downtown Boston, GMO's offices. It's an A-plus summer day. This morning when I got coffee, I literally counted at least 25 sailboats on the Charles River. Nebo Wealth, we've been founded within GMO, Global Asset Manager, the G and GMO, legendary investor, Jeremy Grantham. He's pictured here on the fourth person in on this photo. And our ethos, our culture is really known for thought leadership. And in many ways, our job is to make people think, our clients, prospects, et cetera, just the industry think. And Matt, you recently celebrated your 20-year anniversary at GMO. Congratulations. That's amazing achievement. One place for 20 years. And you worked really closely with Jeremy throughout those years. And I heard you tell this fantastic story about the idea of making people think and what that means to you. So would you be able to just share?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was a long time ago. It was certainly pre-global financial crisis. Jeremy and I were in Toronto talking to clients, and we had one of the meetings we had was with one of the large pension plans in Canada. And so we were standing in the lobby before the host came to get us. It was me, Jeremy, and Paul, our salesperson. And Jeremy kind of turned to me and said, "What can we say that's really going to piss these people off?" And it caused me to laugh out loud. And then it also caused Paul to go ashen because Paul was trying to sell this large pension plan GMO products. And Jeremy said, "Hey, I'm very serious. Our job is to agitate. Our job is to get these people to think, because they're a big pension plan. It's likely that they're following the status quo, and our job is to make them think so that they can think about different ways to make money and improve the outcomes for their participants." And that framing of agitation, he obviously did not really want to piss them off, but he wanted to agitate. And so that framing is something that I've certainly have tried to carry on in my time in the asset allocation team, certainly foster that. And I think the paper that we wrote, The Perils of Outsourcing Risk Management to the asset allocation to a risk management score, certainly is in that vein and tries to carry on that spirit. Never as well as Jeremy could do it, but I think that's an important ethos for what we're trying to continue.
Well, that's such a great story. I remember you telling me that years ago. And I'm proud to say that this paper that we wrote, people are thinking. If you take a look at some of the industry headlines in the summertime since we released the paper in mid-June, I love that they're not declarative statements. They end with a question mark to really get us to start thinking. Has the risk score gained too much power? Are advisors over-reliant on portfolio risk scores? It's really important that we examine these questions really in the pursuit of providing sound advice that's meaningful to clients. And really getting into the learning objectives that I want the audience to take away today from the paper. Number one, we have pitfalls of relying on risk scores for asset allocation. So we're going to introduce the problem. And then solution. Number two, benefits of a comprehensive investment policy process. And then number three, we're going to do a fun real-life case study about building a dynamic, adaptive portfolio tailored to an actual client's needs. We call them the snowbirds. So next, I really wanted to get into Matt, just starting with you about the paper, the inspiration. Just talk a little bit about why did we decide to write this thing?
Yeah, so really the kernel for this idea was emanated from our presentation at GMO's fall conference last year. And so as the autumn winds start to blow here in New England, the investment teams at GMO really focus on our fall conference, which we've been doing now for almost 40 years, trying to convey the best insights, the best investment ideas to our clients. And so this year, or last year rather, we kind of knew what we wanted to say ahead of time, which is a real blessing, because it can be a real pain to try and figure out, what the right topic is. And we had some papers from the CFA Institute sent to us by Rob Daynard, one of our early NEBO advisors discussing the investment policy statement. And so the CFA Institute talked about the three pillars: time horizon, risk tolerance, and target return. And as we read those papers, what we observed was they would talk about time horizon and target return. They would spend about 10 to 15% of the paper focused on those two. And then the rest, the 85, 90% of the discussion was on risk tolerance. And so our view was that these are three pillars and that they should be a better balance between time horizon, target return, and risk tolerance, instead of just focusing what felt to us like almost exclusively on the risk tolerance. And so we gave that presentation. We were brilliant, brought down the house, and then we kind of went about our business of trying to grow the NEBO business. And so we ended up having, we're having conversations with advisors all the time. And we had more and more conversations where we would ask advisors about their process of building portfolios. And what we were seeing was, they used eMoney, they used Money Guide Pro. They would use that process of having the client fill out a risk tolerance questionnaire. That risk tolerance questionnaire was linked to a risk score, and that risk score produced a portfolio with a, if your risk score is 60, you have 60% in equities. And then they would take that portfolio and then they would run what we would consider flawed Monte Carlo simulations, outdated, overly academic, and we would argue distorted Monte Carlo simulations. And we've written white papers on this. And to us, having roots in asset allocation, this struck us as a very flawed process. That the asset allocation is really being driven by the risk score, not by the needs and circumstances of the client. So if the goals and objectives change, the portfolio doesn't change. The portfolio is disconnected from the plan. The portfolio is really tethered or anchored to the risk score. And so we think that struck us as something that we could easily agitate upon, that we believe there's a better process balancing, your target return, your time horizon, your risk tolerance, along with your cash flows and your legacy bequests, that is balancing that as a much better package to improve the outcomes for clients, and just a better process than what we were seeing out there with some advisors.
One of the images that I think we had early on when we were putting the presentation together. So the presentation that we, the title, I think, was something like The Mysterious Case of the Missing Required Return. And we really talked about the fact that the two of the three pillars of the investment policy process, the required return and the time horizon, were effectively being held hostage. They were captive within this investment policy statement, but they were captive within the statement. They weren't really being operationalized to the extent that they should be. And that's one of the real messages, is that we're trying to free, if you will, the required return and the time horizon from the clutches of the risk tolerance.
I love that. And James, he had a line in the paper about the required return and time horizon being banished to a closet, like Harry Potter under the stairs. And that's probably my favorite line in the whole paper. And trivia, I've been watching Harry Potter with my 5-year-old and my wife every night the last couple days for summertime, and I just get such a kick out of it. So Martin, now that we kind of really set up this paper and the reason why we did it, can you provide the audience a brief summary? What are the key things that you want them to glean, or what does it mean to you when you see these pages on the slide?
Well, I think it's really simple, and I think it gets into the title of the paper. Is what is the peril? What are the perils? And the peril is really simple. The peril is you don't get asset allocation right. And if you don't get asset allocation right, that's a really big problem. Now, our observations, we've been out for about 5 or 6 years now, talking to financial advisors about how they do their work, and how our concept of risk is not having what you need when you need it can kind of enhance what they're doing and how it can fit into their workflow. Our observation is that asset allocation is currently in the wrong place in the wealth management assembly line. Asset allocation generally is assumed before the financial planning process actually begins. We think that the asset allocation should be the result of a financial planning process that understands the client's needs and circumstances, their savings, their spending, their legacy goals. Combined with capital market assumptions, that's what should be driving the asset allocation. So we are on a mission to fundamentally reshape the wealth management assembly line by putting asset allocation in its rightful place.
And I think that, the concept of a risk score driving the allocation, we have a line in the paper that is a declaration by the advisor that the risk score representing the client's psychological risk aversion is so well calibrated and fundamentally immutable that all other considerations should be tossed aside. And that is in effect what is happening if the risk score is driving the asset allocation. And I don't necessarily think that advisors believe that the psychological risk aversion is so well calibrated, or that all other considerations should be tossed aside. But in effect, that's what happens when you use the risk score to drive the asset allocation.
Thanks, guys. Well, let's transition a little bit into some more of the meat of the paper. And there's a behavioral finance section that I really enjoyed where we talk about risk scores. The vast majority of clients end up in the moderate risk tolerance bucket, and that results in a one-size-fits-all solution, which is really the polar opposite of the customization that clients demand and that advisors seek to provide. And James had a great line or two that I'm going to read. He refers to this approach as akin to what we might be called shoe size investing. It's like turning up at the shoe shop and saying I'm a size 10, and then the assistant presenting with a pair of shoes without any regard to the activity that you tend to undertake. After all, that activity, what you're going to do, really matters. And my newborn son, he can't walk into the ocean in his Air Jordans. They're going to get super wet and ruined. And conversely, my 5-year-old daughter, she can't do ballet in her soccer cleats. I don't think her ballet teacher is going to like that. Martin, for you, thinking about that one size fits all, how does this translate to real thing that you're hearing on the front lines?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, we've been out talking to advisors for years now. And in the course of, many of those conversations, I can't tell you how often we hear a statement such as 90% of our clients are in our moderate model, and we know that's not the right answer. So we think that this is really stemming from a process that assumes an asset allocation, does a risk score, and then essentially checks to see whether or not that works. The advisors know that this is a problem, and the way that manifests is the other thing that we hear, besides 90% of our clients are in the moderate model, we know that's not the right answer. There's a challenge in connecting the plan to the portfolio, because the portfolio is primarily driven by the risk score, but the plan is about the full texture of the asset owner's financial life. The problem is, if you change the plan, if you change a savings, a spending, a legacy goal, nothing really much happens on the portfolio side because the risk score didn't change. So you see this fundamental disconnect between the planning, what advisors are doing on the planning side, and what they're doing on the portfolio side. And that's where NEBO really comes in. NEBO is really that connective tissue that connects financial planning with asset management or the portfolio.
And I think one of the things that we've observed in conversations with advisors is that, putting a client in the moderate model, it's certainly from a, it's familiar to clients, so it's an easy thing to do. And it, for many clients, it may in fact be the right portfolio given their needs and circumstances. But we've also observed that advisors struggle with suggesting other potential portfolios because they don't have a great framework for moving clients away from the moderate model into something more aggressive or something less aggressive. And that, of course, is what NEBO provides.
Thanks, guys. So, Matt, we keep talking about the importance of asset allocation, and here's just a visual that I'd love if you just elaborated a little bit on it.
Yeah, we've touched about this a couple different ways, but Gary Brinson, Randolph Hood, Gilbert Biebauer, no one ever really talks about those two other guys. But in 1986, they wrote a paper talking about asset allocation, explaining 93.6% return. They've written a subsequent paper kind of adjusting that, and academics, this is a meaty topic for academics, so they leapt in and have their own calculations in terms of how important asset allocation is relative to security selection and in terms of the total return for the clients. And they can have that academic food fight, that's fine. And you see 70, 80, 90%. What you don't see is someone is an academic paper saying asset allocation is 10% or 15%. So I think it is widely recognized that asset allocation is a crucial determinant in client outcomes, which is why the idea that asset allocation is being outsourced to a risk score is something that is such a visceral and important topic for us.
Great. So academics say asset allocation is critical. We say it's critical. Now, what about actual advisors, people on the street that have real clients, the practitioners? We surveyed dozens of you during registration, and we asked on a scale from 1 to 100, how important is it to establish a client's optimal asset allocation? So I'm just going to do a dramatic pause right now before I show the results. And I'd like everybody in the studio audience to just think about, what did you think your jury of peers ranked it from a scale from 1 to 100? So I'm just going to pause for 5 seconds. And if we look at the left-hand side, the answer was 87 out of 100. Nearly half of you said 95 or higher. And this is super consistent with studies that we've done in other webinars. And then also our colleague, Adam Scully-Power. I see you, by the way. He dialed in from Italy, so it's great to have you aboard. He's at conferences, he's speaking on the stage, and he literally takes a mic and he does a man on the street sort of thing, like it's Jimmy Kimmel Live, asking people in their chairs to score it from 1 to 100. And we hear 90, we hear 100. It's just super consistent that it's critical. And we did have an outlier. Somebody did say 8 out of 100. And by the way, if you're on this line, we would absolutely love to chat with you in the spirit of understanding the other perspective. Just going through a couple other survey results that I think are really interesting. And Matt Martin, feel free to chime in on anything that might spark inspiration to talk about. And we did ask, do you think risk scores should be the main factor in determining a client's asset allocation? And 87% of this audience said no or not sure. Majority was no. And we also asked, do you believe that standard risk tolerance questionnaires adequately capture your client's true risk preferences? In many ways, that's an unanswerable question. There's so much art and education and relationship building to answer that. So we're not surprised that 96%, nearly unanimous, said no or not sure. So just open floor, Matt Martin, any reactions?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in and really hone in on the first question of that 87 out of 100 and asset allocation being so important, and sort of tie it back to a comment that I made earlier about how advisors are struggling to connect the plan to the portfolio. And one of the ways that manifests for us is what we see is that advisors are not confident that they're putting the client into the right portfolio. So we've run webinars like this over the years, and one of the questions that we've asked advisors, and I think we have, close to 400 respondents on this one, which is, do you struggle aligning your client's financial plan with the portfolio? And 58% of advisors said they struggle aligning the plan with the portfolio. And that word struggle is a very strong word. We think that is driven in part by this. So advisors understand the importance of asset allocation. It's very intuitive that asset allocation is a crucial part of getting the client to where they need to be over the long term. The problem is they also know intuitively that it's in the wrong place. And so when we wrote this paper, one of the feedbacks that we got was, I've understood intuitively for many years that there's a problem with being over-reliant on the risk score, but I haven't been able to put my finger on it. I think one of the things that we're trying to do with this paper is really help people put their finger on exactly what the issue is, and that key issue is asset allocation is in the wrong place, and it's not being driven by the full totality of the things that matter for the asset owner.
And I just would like to chime in on question number 3 for a second. 96% of advisors saying that risk tolerance questionnaires don't adequately capture their two clients' risk preferences is amazing, because I didn't think you get 96% of advisors to agree on anything. Yet it is, every single advisor, has a risk tolerance questionnaire. And obviously we understand that. I'm actually a reformed attorney. I spent 2 years as in-house counsel at LPL. So I completely understand I completely understand the reason for the risk tolerance questionnaire. And I do think risk tolerance, understanding that, is incredibly important. But I find that this number to be particularly striking, that in light of the fact that everyone has a risk tolerance questionnaire.
So let's keep going. Matt, this one's for you. I love this visual. We made it a couple months ago. Our code name for it, we call this the tale of two clients. And if you could just kind of walk us through this.
Yeah, so if you want to ask the question, how do most clients end up in a moderate model? Well, I think most often it starts with a single input in determining the client's asset allocation. The left-hand side, we have the classic example that we all know: 401k plans, glide paths. The asset allocation is solely dependent upon the client's retirement age. So you have two participants here with very different incomes, very different account balances, very different savings rates, very different risk tolerances, and yet you end up with the same portfolio because they are the same age. And so that is a peril of running asset allocation solely on risk tolerance. A peril, I would also argue, is just running portfolios solely on your age. It needs to be the balance between the different pillars. And then the advisory client really is what we've been talking about so far today, where you have client one, they're young, they don't have as much in assets, they have lower savings, they have a lower account balance, but they take a risk tolerance questionnaire, they come out with a risk tolerance score of 60, voila, they get 60% in equities, even though client one's needs and circumstances are very different than client two, who is older, more in assets, more savings. 60-40 might be the right portfolio for client two, but it's far from clear, or certainly it's harder to understand what that right portfolio is if you're just solely focused on the one pillar, risk tolerance. And that's why the mantra of balancing time horizon, risk tolerance, and target return are critical in providing a portfolio that is directly connected to those clients' needs and circumstances through their financial plan.
And a lot of this really ties into our origin story. We've literally been working on solving this problem, or it came across our desk over a decade ago. Martin, I was hoping that you could share a little bit of the background.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So as Andy mentioned, this project, well, it really started as a question. So it started back in 2013. I was actually in the global equity group at GMO at the time. And I'd been doing more and more work in asset allocation. I got to know Ben Inker very well. He was head of asset allocation. Now he's the co-head of asset allocation. I got to know him well. One day he comes down to my office and he says, I just got off a call with one of our large corporate clients, and they're doing more and more work in the defined contribution space. And they want to know if we have any thoughts on glide paths. Maybe you want to look into glide paths. So I started looking into glide paths, and I just simply wanted to know, how were they building the glide path? But it became very clear very quickly that nobody was really explaining how they were building the glide paths. It was as though my 3-year-old child had taken a bunch of colored crayons and gone from upper left to lower right. So that motivated Ben and I to go back to first principles and to really think about risk from the perspective of the asset owner. And what was very intuitive was that the risk for the asset owner is they don't have what they need when they need it. And so, the obvious question is, well, why don't we build portfolios to minimize that risk? Or in other words, why don't we build portfolios to maximize the likelihood that the asset owner achieves their objectives? So we're talking about the three pillars of the investment policy: the required return, the time horizon, and the risk tolerance. But underlying all that is really a big idea. And that big idea is that the risk for the asset owners, they don't meet their objectives. And so our portfolio construction engine takes all of that information in, but at its core, it's building a portfolio today to minimize the risk or maximize the likelihood that the client achieves their objectives over the entire span of their life. Now, in that original problem, sort of the tale of two clients that Matt went through is perfect, because in the original problem, we're focused on the glide path, and the glide path is really dominated by that single input, which is the time horizon. We've really, like, as we've engaged with financial advisors, they don't really use glide paths, but they're over-reliant on another single input, which is the risk score. Both of those approaches, in our view, are too narrow, that we need to open that up and really focus on the risk that matters most for the asset owner, and that is that they don't have what they need when they need it.
Thanks, Martin. So my head's kind of spinning about this. Peril. We've introduced this problem, and if someone were to buy into the thesis that risk scores have too much power, what's the alternative? What's our solution?
So what we've developed, what we call the investment policy process, and that came from our colleague Adam Scully Power in Italy, molto bene. He came up with this title, but it's taking the CFA Institute investment policy statement, but then expanding it and operationalizing it. So you have time horizon. We need to incorporate your current wealth. We need to build in cash flows or life hedges, and we can take that in from financial planning tools. We need to understand if you have legacy goals, and then we can bring in risk tolerance. And one important point that we tried to make in the paper, and I don't want it to get lost, it's not as though we're saying risk tolerance is not important. We're just saying the risk score should not be the sole determinant of what a client's portfolio should be, that it needs to be a mosaic, a balance of factors. And as Kitsis talks about, it needs to be part of the discussion. So risk tolerance is definitely part of what we're trying to achieve in this investment policy process, because after all, if a client sells out when the market is down and expected returns are up, that is truly tragic. The whole trick with mean reversion, as Jeremy always said, is to get the finish line to the same people you start with. So we're not minimizing risk tolerance. We are arguing against the the near dominance of the risk score or risk tolerance relative to these other factors. And then we can, with the required rate of return, that actually encapsulates all of these different factors. What do you need from what do you have? What do you need from your financial assets? When do you need it? And we bundle that into a required rate of return for the client. And that process, we believe, is much more robust, much more balanced, and ultimately we believe will lead to better outcomes for clients.
Can I just jump in really quickly here? So I was just noticing a question in the webinar, and I think this is a perfect place to answer it. So the question is, how does Nebo complement financial planning tools like MoneyGuide Pro? So if you look at the cash flow box there, what Nebo does is Nebo can take the cash flow report from a MoneyGuide Pro plan and incorporate it directly into the overall process, because those cash flows are an important determinant of what the target path of wealth is, and we're going to show you that in a moment, and is an important driver of what the required return. So it's a fundamental part of the process. We're not trying to reinvent financial planning. We're trying to incorporate it in the most appropriate way into this investment policy process.
Thanks for jumping in, Martin. And just to engage our audience a little bit more, this isn't really a question. It was just a thoughtful comment by Michael. Thanks for joining us. He says, I haven't seen anyone talk about this. The very idea of risk tolerance is not just overused, it's incorrect from the get-go. We financial planners / investment advisors preach rational rather than emotional investing, yet the fundamentals of our portfolio structure include an expectation of emotional misbehavior. Why do we encourage, which we discourage? Time horizon and required return are the components of a consistent, customized plan, as you're saying. So thank you, Michael, for the feedback. I think that's great. It ties in actually perfectly to this next slide. I see Doug, you're in the audience. Hello. Thanks for joining us. As we're out there on the front lines talking to advisors, I have a fun, quick little story. That this required rate of return being a huge unlock. Doug, he's NEBO advisor number 2. He's very active in the CFA community, grader of CFA tests, and he's very attuned to fiduciary responsibility. He was telling the story about how he got involved with NEBO, and he literally grabbed his textbook off the bookshelf. And people do this with us all the time on Zoom calls, which is super fun. And he goes, required return, that is in my CFA curriculum. And I'm just sharing that story just to come full circle, that's what we're taught. And then when it comes to actually operationalizing that, it's a challenge. And going back to investment policy process, sounds great on paper. I'm starting a little bit to have a nightmare about spreadsheets and manual work. Matt, I've heard you talk before about an example with a hypothetical client, the snowbirds. Love that example. Can you share how we actually operationalize this idea?
Absolutely. So we had a LinkedIn post a couple weeks ago, and we decided to call it the snowbirds because it's been hotter than hell in Boston this summer. It's 89 degrees out right now. So naturally, my mind went to the Great Mountain West, and for this particular couple, the Wasatch Mountains, and skiing in Utah. But Tim and Sue, they're 55. They plan on retiring when they're 62. They have 3.1 million of current wealth. When they retire, they want to buy a ski. They want to retire at 62 and buy a ski condo in Utah. They've done financial planning work. They understand that they're going to be saving $40,000 a year until they hit retirement, and then they'll need $160,000 a year in cash flow needs. So if their goal, the minimum return necessary in order to make this plan work, we can think about if you wanted to die with zero, a very good book by Bill Perkins. The internal rate of return, or the required rate of return, is actually 2.3% net of taxes, fees, and inflation. That is the minimum return in order to make this client's plan work. And here we are using capital market assumptions, NEBO Wealth's capital market assumptions. But that required rate of return also produces a target path of wealth. So this is really helpful for clients because they think in account balances. They don't always think in terms of required return. You can see that savings increasing from 3.1 as you add more cash into the portfolio, as you also generate a return. And then you can see the black dot starts to fall. That's the purchase of the ski condo. And then that target wealth path is an impact of the target return as well as the cash flows. And so NEBO's job is to keep this client out of the red zone, to minimize the likelihood that they're in the red zone and maximize the likelihood that they achieve their goals. And so with that required rate of return, time horizon, cash flows, we can generate an optimal portfolio. So here, the portfolio that maximizes the likelihood that Tim and Sue achieve their goal, it's got 44% in stocks, 16% in alts, 20%. I can't read the 20% in short-term bonds, and 21% in long-term bonds. And so if their goal is to die with zero, this is the optimal portfolio for them. Now, if their goals and objectives change, we would expect their portfolio to change as well. So if we wanted to add in a legacy goal of $2 million, so they have some kids, they have some charities that they want to take care of, let's fold in a $2 million legacy goal. And then also, let's increase their income needs in retirement. Lift tickets aren't getting any cheaper, new skis, etc. Let's increase their income need in retirement by 10%. Okay, what does that do to the target required rate of return? That now jumps from 2.3 to 3.5. And the path of wealth is very different relative to a path of wealth where you end up dying with zero. So here you can see the same shape pre-retirement, but now post-retirement, because our goal is to compound at 3.5% real, you can see where that target path of wealth is. NEBO's job is still the same. Keep the client out of the red zone. but you have a different plan, you have different goals and objectives, you have a different required return, you have a different target wealth path, and then you have a different portfolio. So here, this portfolio has more in equities, not surprisingly, almost 60% in equities, less in short-term and long-term bonds, and liquid alts. Liquid alts is about the same. So this is a portfolio that, when the plan changes, the portfolio correspondingly changes directly as well. So it is a portfolio that is connected to the plan. And then within Nebo Wealth, what you would do, you could either kind of click a button and we can send that portfolio off, or so here we have the kind of fictional tickers and symbols. So Nebo is open architecture from an implementation standpoint. Mutual funds, ETFs, individual securities, direct indexes. We've even built some factor portfolios for folks and implemented them through Nebo. If you're satisfied with this portfolio, you can then use Nebo's viability testing tools, using our next generation Monte Carlo simulation, which corrects for the overly academic, flawed, and distorted Monte Carlos that you see in most financial planning tools, and that will confirm the viability of the overall plan. And if you're satisfied, you click export, and you can send today's portfolio off to your rebalancer, or it can be traded directly within Nebo Wealth. And one of the things that we get feedback consistently from clients is that Nebo Wealth provides portfolios that are much more intuitive, based on how they think about markets, how they think about clients relative to just, again, outsourcing that asset allocation to the risk score.
Can I just jump in with a couple of points, Andy? One is to really emphasize the point that Matt just made, is that one of the things that we observe is that Nebo really helps both the advisor and the client really understand what they have to believe to own this portfolio. So the advisor really understands it. It substantially increases the confidence that they have that they're putting the client into the right portfolio, and it puts them in a much stronger position to educate the client and get the client comfortable, and they can do it much faster. Can't tell you how many times we've had calls over the last couple of years where advisors will call us and say, after a particular volatile period in the market, I used to have to spend 90 minutes with a client, kind of getting them refocused on what really matters. But with Nebo now, it's a 5 or 10 minute conversation. So that's number one. Number two, Andy, if you can go back to the target wealth path, I just want to make a couple of points about this. Is that what Nebo's doing is not just minimizing the probability that the client's wealth falls into that red area, but it's accounting for the magnitude as well. So if you're just a little bit below your wealth target, that's very different than if you're really far below. And Nebo accounts for that. And that turns out to be an important technical issue. The other is the role that the required return plays. So the required return is just a way to encapsulate. It's like a single number that kind of summarizes the whole plan. It's really powerful because we have intuition about that number. If the required return came back and it said 15 or 20% net of inflation, taxes, and fees, that would be a number that the advisor would immediately know this is not really a particularly viable plan. Like, we're not going to be able to achieve that. But it's important to realize that Nebo is not just building a portfolio to get 2.3% a year, because Nebo is going to take advantage of the long time horizon. And when you have a long time horizon, it's going to put the asset owner into a portfolio that, generally speaking, has an expected return that's higher than the target compound return. So what you'll see over time when you track the client's wealth is that the gap between the actual wealth and the target wealth is going to grow, and that the target wealth, the actual wealth, is going to exceed the target wealth by more and more over time.
Gotcha. Thanks for the context, Martin. When I see keep their wealth out of the red zone, and I think about our shortfall optimization, football season, the new college football video game's out, Madden just got released, and I'm thinking about our optimization being a world-class defense, or Ed Reed, if anyone's familiar with him. He's an amazing safety on the Baltimore Ravens. Just keeping the wealth out of the red zone. That's what we're looking to do. We're looking to make sure that we maximize the likelihood you achieve your goals. I did get a comment just come in from Bryce, and I just wanted to read it on the screen. It's not really a question, more of a comment, but we appreciate it. Just met with a client, has a low risk number determined by a shaky market. Now that the market's racing higher, she's a much higher risk number until, of course, the market's shaky again, when she'll return to a lower number. So what's the risk number's ultimate value? It's a shallow, distorted process, leaving the client and advisor vulnerable and at risk. So I've repented to Nebo Wealth. So thank you for that comment, Bryce. We appreciate you, and thanks for joining us.
That's that's a wonderful comment. I keep thinking about, as I get older and I reflect on my 2 decades here at GMO, like so many times things I've heard Jeremy say keep popping back up. And one of the things he said a long time ago, he said, if you do right by the client, everything will take care of itself. And that is the ethos of what we're trying to do within Nebo Wealth, that we want to improve client outcomes. And we've spent a lot of time, and Nebo really is a distillation of 35 years of asset allocation experience in order to improve those client outcomes, directly linking the plan and the portfolio, helping the advisors with confidence, helping the clients with confidence, helping them understand their plan. And ultimately, Nebo is a tool that we believe advisors will help ultimately improve client outcomes and also help them grow and scale their business. And that, I think, it's the combination of all of those factors which makes this so much fun for us.
So we're running up on time. We're at about the end in terms of our prepared remarks. If anyone wants to stay for Q&A, we did get a couple of thoughtful questions come in, and I'd be comfortable for the events team dialing in on this if we go a couple minutes over, if anyone wants to stay listening to us answer some questions. We got one coming in from Jack. He asks, how often are your asset class capital market assumptions updated? Can those be customized or overridden by advisors?
Yeah, so the capital market assumptions are all open architecture. So we can make GMO's capital market assumptions available to you. We don't require you to use them. Those CMAs are actually updated on a daily basis, but you can use your own capital market assumptions, and we encourage you to explore and test your intuition with different assumptions. Within Nebo Wealth, what we use is a combination of 1/3 GMO capital market assumptions and 2/3 long-term averages. We generally update those every quarter, unless you get a large move in the market, and then we will update them on an intra-quarter basis. But the platform itself is incredibly flexible in terms of implementation and capital market assumptions.
Yeah, I just want to reemphasize that one of the key design considerations when we built the platform was really to make it a tool or a device to help people understand. And so it's very easy to change capital market assumptions and to see the impact that that has on the portfolio. And oftentimes what people will find is that there's a particular element of the portfolio that is kind of the driver at a particular point in time, and it really helps them understand kind of the things they need to focus on relative to that particular client and relative to what's happening in the markets.
Thanks, guys. Got another question come in from Brandon. Brandon, it's great to have you. He asks, can you quantify how much better off a client will be by not just using risk scores plus model portfolios? It seems like most advisors do that as a way. It's kind of sufficing mechanism, satisficing, that's still scalable for the advisor, even though most advisors kind of know deep down there's a more optimal customized approach, but that does introduce complexity. So how would we answer that?
So the short answer is, I think in our Investing for Retirement 2 paper, we go through a case study where we use sort of a well-known glide path, and we compare the shortfall-based approach and horizon and required return, et cetera, based approach. And then we also layer on top of moving your assets based on how expensive or how cheap they are. And basically what we find is that if you reduce it to sort of what is the excess return that would be required if you had a suboptimal asset allocation or a suboptimal glide path. In the example that we used, it was about 150 basis points in total that you would have had to add to that suboptimal glide path in order to get to kind of the correct approach. But that number is very context specific. Now, we have very advanced features in Nebo which allow you to do that research yourself. So we have what we call the glide path tab, is where you can compare two different glide paths. You can change the capital market assumptions on either one. You can change the shape of the glide path in both cases, and you can do a compare and contrast. So you don't have to take our word for it. You can actually do that kind of analysis yourself in the platform. And that's one of the advanced features that we have in there.
Yeah, Martin, I think that's investing for retirement 3. I think you said investing for retirement 2.
I think investing for retirement 2 does have the alpha table at the very end, but I may be wrong about that. It doesn't.
We'll do lunch over it. When this is over, we'll see who wins. It might be in both. So we're right past 45. So we're at the end. But if anyone wanted to stay, it looks like most people are still here. You know, someone just commented, Martin, that they want your whiteboard as their backdrop with all your gory math and all that good stuff on there and all the variables.
So I have to jump in here, and I have to say that I did not write a single character on that whiteboard. That whiteboard has no finance and investing. That whiteboard is written entirely by Andy and by Adam, who's in Italy. But they wrote the entire whiteboard. So not only are we very sophisticated on the finance and investing side, but as you can tell, we're very sophisticated on the sales and marketing side as well.
Great. Well, it looks like most of you are still here. I'll take your vote if everyone wants to leave. We got a couple of good questions, one about asset location. We got another one about, hey, are there any suggestions for different risk tolerance questionnaires that you might want to use? So I do want to address those while we have a captive audience, unless literally everybody logs off in the next 10 seconds. So maybe Matt, Martin, you can take this one. This is from our friend John over in California. He goes, I'm a convert, but I still think that a risk tolerance level is very important because people aren't robots. They're emotional. We can't have them pulling the plug when times get tough. I'm not sure the best way to go about determining a client's tolerance. You know, he goes on a little bit and then he goes, what are your thoughts on the best way to determine that? Can you throw out any good questionnaires that others might be using in conjunction with Nebo?
Yeah. So Matt, I think, mentioned earlier that we want to be really, really clear. We are not saying that risk tolerance or loss aversion does not matter. It is really important. We do not want, nobody wants the asset owner to bail out at exactly the wrong time. So one of the things that we're doing is, so the way that Nebo ultimately handles that problem is via constraints on the portfolio, either a maximum stock constraint or a maximum total portfolio volatility constraint. Now, one of the primary questions that will drive that constraint is what is the maximum loss that the asset owner can tolerate in a bad bear market? But that's a single question. And the answer to that question may be flawed. So what we're doing is we're going to, we have an array of, I think right now it's about 7 to 10 additional questions that will test to see whether or not the answers to those questions are consistent with the answer to the question is what is the maximum loss that you could tolerate in a bad bear market? Again, this is where we don't believe in silver bullets. We believe in building a mosaic and establishing consistency at all levels of the sort of investment policy process. So that's one way that we're going to be addressing that.
Great. Thanks, Martin. Someone just asked, they noticed in our investment policy process a missing item, asset location, particularly as it relates to tax considerations. There are no automated tools to address tax location that I'm aware of. So I'm just going to go to the investment policy process here so we can all take a look at it. And where does asset location fit in here? Just what are your thoughts about how to incorporate that?
So right now, we do not account directly for asset location. We can account indirectly for asset location, where the capital market assumptions, you can put in Nebo, you can put in pre-tax capital market assumptions, you can then specify how assets are located, and we can convert those pre-tax capital market assumptions to after-tax capital market assumptions. But we are doing research, and we believe that hopefully sometime next year, we will be able to incorporate asset location directly into our multi-period shortfall optimization. So we are optimistic that we will be able to solve that problem in a very comprehensive way in the not too distant future.
Great, makes sense. And, last question that came in from Jack. He just mentioned, why is your system better for wealth advisors? I do want to say, just if you wanted to learn more about us and why we think we are a solution that could help, visit our website, nebowealth.com. We have an active LinkedIn page. We try to do one fun post a day. And please feel free to reach out for a demo. We'd actually love to have a one-on-one personal call with you. We view ourselves as consultants as well. We're looking for win-win situations where we can just educate you on our view of the industry, things like that. Matt Martin, did you want to take that one at all as kind of the last thing before we sign off?
Yes. So I think, one thing just to be clear, eMoney, Money Guide Pro, Right Capital, they do a great job of generating cash flows, understanding the client's needs, building out goals-based financial planning. Nebo is not trying to replicate that. We want to build on top of that. Where we believe they fall woefully short is when they move out of their realm of expertise into the investment side, into the asset allocation side. The only way they know how to build portfolios is tethering it to a risk score. And we've talked, at great lengths why we think that is not a great way to manage portfolios. So we're not trying to replace Money Guide Pro. We can integrate those cash flows into Nebo and then build on top of that with an investment policy process that is much better balanced, much more intuitive, and a process that we believe will lead to better outcomes because it's going to be tied directly to the client's goals, financial plan, unique needs and circumstances.
Yeah, I'll just jump in with a really quick answer to that. The reason I think we're better is because I think we start with the big idea, and I think we start by asking the question that matters most to the asset owner. What do you need and when do you need it? And then we are building portfolios to maximize the likelihood that the client achieves their objectives over their entire life, and giving you a process for repeating that over time. One of the things that we didn't mention is this is not a one and done, but this is a process that must be repeated consistently over time as the client's needs and circumstances change and as the capital markets change.
Great. Thanks, everybody. So with that, appreciate you all joining. Almost 80% of you stayed until the very end. So thanks so much. Wishing you and your family really well in the summertime. Hope you have a good barbecue, good pool day, good vacations planned. And I just wanted to give a quick shout out and thank you to the team behind the scenes that aren't on the screen. I'm looking right now at Jack on the other side. Thank you, Jack. You did an amazing job. Both Adams on the technology side. Olivia, you're crushing it on the events team. Marie, thanks so much for the graphic design. And Stephanie from On24. We appreciate you. Thanks for making sure that everything went off good today. And thanks again for joining. And I hope you guys all have a great summer, and gals.